Italy, 72 BC. The Roman Republic is entangled in a bitter slave revolt. Around 120,000 former slaves and gladiators resist the oppression of their former masters. At the head of their company sits one of the most famous revolutionaries in history, Spartacus. Our tale of Spartacus's life begins in Thrace. He was born in the region of the river Struma around 109 BC. Very little is known of Spartacus's early life. However, Florus and Plutarch generally agree that Spartacus was likely a Thracian mercenary. In this trade, he was made an auxiliary, or a civilian soldier in the Roman military. At some point in his career, he deserted or committed some kind of crime against Rome and was captured soon after. It is said he possibly carried out bandit raids whilst he was on the run. Spartacus's punishment was to be made a Roman slave, and due to his considerable talents and strengths, he was sold as a Roman gladiator. Spartacus was sold in a humiliating naked slave auction sometime before 73 BC. He was then trained at a gladiator school, or ludus, owned by Lentulus Batiatus near Capua in southern Italy. His particular stature anointed him with the gladiator title of Murmillo, or heavyweight. These gladiators carried a large oblong shield and a gladius into their fights. In the first half of 73 BC, Spartacus and two Gauls named Crixus and Oenomaus led around 70 to 80 other slaves in an uprising against their masters. They stole kitchen equipment, wagons, and other supplies. They killed the guards of the ludus, stole their weaponry, and then fled to pillage Capua. Their escape emboldened other slaves in the area, who then flocked to Spartacus's side. After taking their fill of Capua, the group retreated to a more defensible position beside the extinct volcano of Mount Vesuvius. The non-fighters were trained in rudimentary combat skills whilst they were encamped there. The revolt happened in quite a popular vacationing area for Roman dignitaries of the time. These rich and powerful had estates in the area which could possibly be targets for what they saw as basically an extreme crime wave. For this reason, Rome reacted quite quickly to the uprising, but didn't really treat the revolt as anything more than a policing matter. Around the autumn of 73 BC, they dispatched a fairly low-ranking praetor named Gaius Claudius Glaber and around 3,000 soldiers to put an end to Spartacus and his men. Glaber besieged Spartacus by blocking the only path off the mountain. He did this under the hopes that starvation would force the slaves into surrender. Ingeniously, the Spartacans, as they came to be called, fashioned makeshift ropes from vines and local vegetation. They scaled the walls of Vesuvius to perform a surprise attack on Glaber from behind. Spartacus's forces defeated the Romans very easily, and it is not clear whether Glaber died during the battle, as his name is not mentioned afterwards. The Battle of Mount Vesuvius is commonly seen as the first battle of the Third Servile War, or the Third Great Slave Revolt. Rome reacted by sending another praetor named Publius Varinius to try and deal with the problem. For some reason, the praetor decided to split his army into two under the command of his two lieutenants, diminishing his overall fighting number. Again, the slaves easily dispatched the Romans. They killed the praetor's lieutenants, stole their arms and equipment from their enemy, and almost captured the praetor himself. Unfortunately, during this time, one of the slave leaders, Oenomaus, was likely killed. His name is not mentioned in the records of the slave revolt afterwards. Spartacus was showing himself to be a very keen tactician. He used tactics that in modern times would be seen as guerrilla warfare. The continual military successes of Spartacus attracted more and more slaves to the Spartan forces, and their number is said to have reached heights of 70,000 at this point. In the winter of 73 BC, the Spartan forces plundered 4 distinct regions of southern Italy. The distance between the regions plundered suggests that the army was by this point broken up into 2 distinct forces led by Spartacus and Crixus. In spring 72 BC, the Spartans moved northwards. At the same time, Rome, who were now in shock at the defeat of their praetors, decided to send 2 consular legions under the command of Lucius Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus. These 2 legions were quite successful from the get-go. In their first attack on the slaves, they defeated Crixus and his 30,000 men near Mount Garganus. A lot of confusion comes when trying to understand the intentions of Spartacus during the war. Whilst it's easy to see his army as a clear struggle against oppression, Spartacus's actions do very little to confirm that his goal was actually to reform slavery. In fact, it's more likely that Spartacus had intended to march on Rome itself, or go north and disperse his army to their homelands. It's also entirely possible that Spartacus simply wanted to plunder Italy for as long as he could. The most respected historical accounts of what happened after the defeat of Crixus are fairly inconclusive. Appian and Plutarch's depictions are pretty contradictory and give different meanings to Spartacus's actions. The key facet of Appian's version of events is that he tells the story as if Spartacus's intention is to march on Rome. Appian states that after the death of Crixus, the 2 legions followed Spartacus's army towards Cisalpine Gaul in northern Italy, where the consul Lentulus moved ahead to try and block Spartacus's path. The idea was to force Spartacus into a battle on 2 sides, where he was trapped between the 2 legions. However, Spartacus defeated Lentulus. He then turned his army around and then defeated Clodianus. The battles created disarray, and the Romans were forced to retreat. Appian then says that in revenge of Crixus, Spartacus held gladiatorial games where he forced 300 Roman prisoners to fight to the death. Spartacus then travelled north, now with a force of around 120,000 men. There, he encountered the combined might of the consular legions once more. He defeated them yet again. It was at this point that Spartacus decided not to attack Rome because of his current manpower, and decided to move to southern Italy again, where he captured Thurii. In this region, he traded spoils of war for metal to make weapons and armour. The idea that Spartacus wanted to attack Rome could have easily been caused by the fear and terror that his men were inciting across the country. The last slave revolt had taken place in faraway Sicily, but to the Romans this one was way too close to home. Daily news of atrocities against slave owners brought dismay, and the mere mention of Spartacus's name was terrifying to Romans. From the Republic's point of view, the slave army seemed to be some kind of unstoppable force. This reputation could have influenced Appian's perspective on the events that actually took place. Plutarch was under the assumption that the intention of Spartacus's men were to flee over the Alps to freedom. Plutarch speaks of similar events to Appian, but in his version, after the original defeat of consul Lentulus, both legions were then recalled to Rome. The consuls were then stripped of their command of those legions. Plutarch makes no mention of a fight against Clodianus's legion, nor the combined might of the consular legions that took place afterwards. He does, however, state another battle that took place, which Appian doesn't mention. Plutarch details a fight between Spartacus and the leader of Cisalpine Gaul, named Gaius Cassius Longinus. Spartacus defeated this commander and some 10,000 men before unexpectedly turning south again. Plutarch makes no mention of the occupation of Thurii, but later speaks of the Spartacans being accosted in the same area. As to why Spartacus decided to turn south instead of just fleeing over the Alps is a contradiction that Plutarch doesn't explain. If his goal was to simply free his men to their homelands, why did he turn away from clear access out of Italy? Whatever the intentions of Spartacus, almost all sources agree that at the start of 71 BC, the Spartans were encamped in southern Italy. At this point, Rome were quaking in their boots about the endless military success that Spartacus seemed to enjoy. They entrusted their faith to Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome and a member of the first triumvirate. Rome empowered him as a praetor to put an end to Spartacus and his terror. They assigned him 6 new legions, as well as the remnants of the 2 former legions that had previously failed to defeat the slave army. Crassus commanded a combined might of up to 42,000 trained and armed soldiers. Crassus began a series of skirmishes with the Spartans, which he was surprisingly proficient at winning. Spartacus led his men to Rhegium, pursued by Crassus. Crassus ordered 6 of his legions to border the region to the south controlled by Spartacus. They constructed fortifications which cut off the slave army from supplies. These fortifications comprised of over 60 kilometers of ditches and walls. He commanded the remaining 2 of his legions, led by the general Mummius, to approach the Spartacans from behind, but importantly, not to attack. Mummius disobeyed Crassus and decided to attack the Spartacans at an apparently opportune moment. His men were easily routed by Spartacus. To discipline his men, Crassus reinstigated the ancient process of troop decimation, where 1/10 of his soldiers were summarily executed for failure. This provided his men the motivation to succeed, as they feared their commander way more than their enemy. In the meantime, in northern Italy, Pompey was returning from Hispania with his legions. Pompey's forces were ordered to bypass Rome entirely and move to reinforce Crassus. Crassus feared that Pompey would try to take credit for the routing of the slave army, and so entreated with Spartacus for a quick end to the war. Those negotiations were not successful. Plutarch says that there was an attempt by Spartacus to trade with Sicilian pirates to ferry him and 2,000 of his men over to Sicily. Spartacus intended to start a new slave revolt there, and in so doing gather reinforcements for his fight against Crassus. Supposedly, the pirates took payment, but then never showed up to transport the Spartacans. Some attempts at shipbuilding were made, but Crassus deployed unnamed measures to prevent Spartacus reaching Sicily, and the shipbuilding was eventually abandoned. Spartacus began a series of silent guerrilla attacks on Crassus's fortifications. He fought open a channel with which to escape southern Italy with 50,000 of his men. A branch of the Spartacans led by commanders Gannicus and Castus broke off and went their own way as a separate force, but they were eventually chased down by Crassus's men and defeated. Discipline in Spartacus's army finally began to collapse as Crassus caught up with them. Beside the river Selenium near Lucania, Spartacus turned his force around. He brought his entire army to bear against the Roman legions. Supposedly before the fight, Spartacus slit the throat of his own horse. He then proclaimed that should they win, they will have their pick of as many horses as they want, but should they lose, they will have no need of horses. Plutarch and Appian both agree that Spartacus fought bravely and valiantly in his final battle. He attempted desperately to kill Crassus, who was kept far away from the fight watching on from his horse. Spartacus is said to have killed 2 seasoned legionnaires in his pursuit of the richest man in Rome. Despite being injured very heavily on one leg, he carried on until the end. Here is Appian's rendition of his death. Spartacus was wounded in the thigh with a spear and sank upon his knee, holding his shield in front of him and contending his way against his assailants, until he and the great mass of those with him were surrounded and slain. Spartacus's body was never recovered. The slave army lost the day. Of the 50,000 slaves that fought Crassus, a few thousand of them actually survived. A large number fled the field of battle and were eventually caught and killed by Pompey's forces. Pompey claimed credit for the topple of Spartacus after his small intervention. Crassus then crucified 6,000 surviving slaves. There were so many that he lined the Appian Way from Capua to Rome with their bodies. That's it, thanks for watching. Thanks for supporting us here at Aspect History. What do you think Spartacus intended to do? Let us know in the comments. If you're new to us, why not check out one of our other videos, linked right here. I've been Circle Strafe, and I'll see you in the next episode. Toodles!